Welcome. I'm Dr. Zabelin, and I'm presenting the NUCA perspective in upper cervical chiropractic. So the first presentation I thought I'd start with is history of NUCA. Uh, and actually, like I like to call it, the history of the world according to NUCA, but not. So in 1934, Dr. Wernsing begins teaching a new approach to upper cervical adjusting and publishes a book titled Atlas Specific. What's interesting about this is that he was the first person to actually start x-raying bones for positional relationships. And the way that he did this was he had a frame in which he suspended anatomical upper cervical bone samples and had them wired with turnbuckles. And what he did was he actually turned the turnbuckles to physically displace the vertebra in relationships to one another, and then see if that same misalignment appeared on X-ray, and it did. And so that's how all of chiropractic analysis of X-ray malposition began. In 1946, John Grostic Sr. introduces the Grostic technique and had begun working with Ralph Gregory in 1941. And they continued developing the upper cervical approach. Dr. Grostic Sr. was the first person to receive the D.D. Palmer Award. Now, looking at the significance of that, recognizing the philosophical and political environment in those years at Palmer, anybody who was deviating from what the Palmers taught was very much suspect. And so for Dr. Grostic to receive this award is a very significant achievement indeed. So in 1964, Grostic Sr. dies, and shortly thereafter, upper cervical work splintered. And this is not a full listing, but Grostic continued under Dr. Grostic Jr. NUCA was formed under Dr. Ralph Gregory. Orthogonality, Atlas Orthogonal under Roy Sweat, CBP, Pettibon, Sonar, Total Support Variant, and many others. There's the work of the Umbers, there's McAlpine, really a lot of directions all at once. And what's interesting about that is that in 1991, I think it was, an organization was formed called the AUCCO, which was the Association of Upper Cervical Chiropractic Organizations. And Dr. Keith Denton, one of our NUCA docs, was president of that. And this was the first time that upper cervical doctors actually got together and compared notes. And so after, close to 30 years of independent development, we had this conference where we actually compared what each of us as a group was doing, and was found that in fact we had fairly similar parallel development, which is always encouraging. In 1973, NUCRA, which stands for the National Upper Cervical Chiropractic Association, is formed to research the upper cervical reduction. This is now known as the Ralph Gregory Foundation, and it has actually a Canadian chapter as well. And it's registered in Michigan as a nonprofit 401c status, so that any donations are tax deductible. In 1975, NUCA introduced the anatometer. Now, the anatometer was basically a pelvic caliper measuring device that was set in a frame. The original model had foot leveling motors that would, let's say that you had an adjustment on a patient and were satisfied with the x-ray correction, and yet the legs would not balance. This then would allow you to determine by what level foot support should be given. Later, it was changed into a base that had transducers for weight differential. It also measures rotation of the pelvis and also measures the fixed point. And it's an instrument that has been a pillar in the NUCA work in terms of the research and in using it. And Benish, the manufacturer who created it, with the help of Dr. Gregory, built this machine to such a high standard that every single unit that has been produced is still in use today. although they were expensive and they were very, very highly machined with jewel indexing and all of this. It's really, really nice machines. Benish is no longer interested in producing this, and so that we have the plans, and I digitized them, and they're now at another manufacturer who's produced a prototype that we'll evaluate and see if it meets the standards. In 1986, Dr. Gregory receives a tribute from then President Ronald Reagan. And this is significant because this was the first time that a chiropractor was honored at the White House for his or her work. In 1987, Dr. Gregory receives the D.D. Palmer Award, which is, significant considering that, Dr. Grostic received the first one. In 1990, Dr. Gregory dies on March 1st, and Dr. Birdie, who was my mentor, a doctor in British Columbia and a longtime student of Dr. Gregory's, assumes the presidency. And those were not the best of years for NUCA. In 1998, Dr. Birdie resigns, along with some board members, for political, philosophical, and personal reasons. And for the organization, that represented a schism that had to be overcome, which we did, and the organization has grown. On a sad note, Dr. Birdie died himself in 2017. In 2002, NUCA and NUCRA published the NUCA Protocols and Perspectives, a textbook for the National Upper Cervical Chiropractic Association. And this is the definitive text on everything that is NUCA. It's everything from its philosophic basis to its procedures, to X-ray, to biomechanics, and a look into the future. And I was honored to be asked to write a chapter. I wrote the X-ray analysis chapter for this book. And it's currently, some parts of it are outmoded, but new procedures have been published, and probably the next time that we publish this book, it will be in digital form, not a printed copy. In 2007, Dr. Backers, who's a cardiologist in Chicago, publishes a study in an index journal. This was a double-blind study that demonstrated the lowering of hypertension utilizing the NUCA procedure. And what it was a test group that received a legitimate adjustment and a sham adjustment for the control group. Both groups had pre and post X-rays. The test group actually demonstrated a reduction, whereas the control group did not. In other words, the listing was the same pre and post. And so these subjects were monitored for 6 to 8 weeks. And what it was found was that with one adjustment in most cases, the test group had a lowering of blood pressure, of the systolic pressure, of about 17 millimeters of mercury pressure on average. It's very significant because at the time it was considered to be about like the top two medications combined. We run conferences that are biannually with a three-tier program that runs simultaneously to help both the beginner as well as the more advanced doctors. And then there are special classes for doctors pursuing certification, and we actually have additional classes that are for certified doctors only. We currently also have a recertification program that requires that every doctor in the program be recertified for whatever level that doctor has attained. So even doctors who are fully certified every 2 years have to submit X-rays to demonstrate that we're still meeting the standard. There are many other important highlights in NUCA's history. For example, the development of the 4 basic types. I have a separate lecture on that, which we'll go through shortly. And that is that NUCA measures the upper angle for acute laterality, the lower angle for the cervical line, head tilt, plane line, whether they're ipsilateral or contralateral angles. And these are grouped into 4 distinct types. And this is something that then has to do with biomechanics, headpiece placement, vector adjustments, etc. So the triceps pull biomechanics, this is something that is characteristic of the NUCA adjustment. It's the way that the doctor uses his or her hands and shoulder girdle to deliver the adjustment. There's no depth to the adjustment, so that it's a very gentle adjustment. Then we also have a headpiece placement. There are 4 positions on a patient's skull that are used to support the 4 different basic types. And then the headpieces that we have a standard headpiece that has a square support, which is itself divided into 3 sections, depending on the type. And then there's a rounded section, which is used for a different type. We also had development of a multi-support headpiece that has movable plates for the support of the mastoid or parietals, and then the frontal and occipital bones can also be supported. And this was thought that this would help in reducing large rotations. Then there's the notch transverse resultant development. This is something that is used to represent the line of drive when the doctor is approaching a patient's listing. And it emanates from the doctor's episternal notch and ends at the contact hand of piezoform, which of course is at the transverse process of C1 at the contact. And this is a line that represents the action of both hands, which is the sum of those two vectors. And it is also perpendicular to the glenoid fosses. It has to be aligned with the same angle that emanates from the pelvic bones. So these lines have to be parallel in the adjustment and directed down the reduction pathway. Finally, we have the phases of the adjustment. We'll go through that as a separate lecture as well. There are 8 phases, and it's just like if you had to describe learning to walk, you would have chapters of how to walk. And so in delivering the adjustment, we have phases of the adjustment. So this is something that all of us do on every adjustment, except for when you take something straight on. But for the saddleback and all the parts of the adjustment, there is a procedure that all of us follow.